Good evening and Happy New Year. For those of you who are joining our program for the first time, my name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi, the Director of Spirit Alive, an educational ministry of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York, whose generous support makes our programming possible. Tonight, we are live streaming the presentation from St. Thomas More Church on the campus of St. John's University. So those of you in our virtual audience at home will be joined by a live audience here in the church. I would like to thank Father Patrick Griffin of Ascension Priest, who ministers here at St. John's and who is a member of the Spirit Alive Advisory Board, for arranging the use of this facility and its audio-visual equipment. I'd also like to thank Dennis Gallagher, who's the head of operations here in the church and who was kind enough to respond to my emails during his Christmas vacation, and also our Spirit Alive tech assistant, Matthew Moby-John, who is here tonight to live stream our event. Tonight, our Vatican II anniversary series continues with a focus on Nostra Aetate, the declaration on the relation of the Church with non-Christian religions, the shortest, and as we will hear, one of the most controversial documents coming out of the Council, which introduced a sea change in the Catholic Church's thinking about and approach toward non-Christian religions. After 60 years, it remains a foundational text for interreligious dialogue. We are fortunate tonight to have with us Professor Celia Deutsch, who will help us understand the monumental. Is currently a research scholar in the religion department at the Barnard College of Columbia University, where she taught from 1985 till 2012. Celia was raised in an interfaith family with a Catholic mother and Jewish father. And as she recognizes, being raised by parents of two different religions planted a seed in her life that bore fruit many years later in both her academic pursuits and her professional research and writing, with its focus on early Jewish and Christian social religious history. Professor Deutsch is engaged in interreligious dialogue at the national, international, and local levels. She is a sister of the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion and recently became the coordinator of her congregation's international team for Jewish-Christian relations. This new work will include projects in interreligious dialogue in a variety of international contexts. Professor Deutsch is active in numerous professional books and articles and is currently working on 2 new books. In her free time, she travels once a year to Zimbabwe to teach at Holy Trinity College. We are grateful to Celia for taking the time to be with us this evening to enlighten us about Nostra Aetate. We welcome you, Celia, and your remarks. Thank you. I'm sorry, before Celia begins, just to let you know, at the end of her presentation, there'll be a Q&A period. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and a mic will be given to you. For our virtual audience at home, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Someone here will read them and Professor Deutsch will respond. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to do 2 things before beginning. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to Maria Pascuzzi, the board, and the staff of Spirit Alive for inviting me to share with you some perspectives on Nostra Aetate. And the second thing I'd like to do is to say a special thank you to Father Michael Perry and to my friends, Toby Sanchez, Michael Hipsher, Sally Hipsher, and Rosa Waldron from the Interfaith Coalition of Brooklyn, with whom how should we say, we've shared a lot of adventures over a very long period of time. Father Perry was the pastor of Our Lady of Refuge Church for 17 years, and came about 3 years after we began interfaith work, and then helped to lead us forward for all of those years. So it's wonderful to have him here with us. In the interest of transparency, I have to say that Nostra Aetate has deeply personal meaning for me, not only because of my family's history, but my religious congregation, the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion, has by its very charism a commitment to interfaith understanding, to social justice and the care of creation in the context of the study and contemplation of the Word of God. I have lived with Nostra Aetate and its implications since I was a novice in the early 60s. I remember Gregory Baum, a peritus at the council and a member of the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, who was working on the document at the time. He visited our novitiate in Western Canada, speaking of the hard and exciting work going on in Rome. I remember the collective excitement in the congregation as the draft first made its way to the council floor. I remember a sense of hope and possibility. This evening, I would like to revisit the story of that document, its reception, and its ongoing relevance. As you have heard repeatedly in this series, Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli was elected Pope in October of 1958, and 2 months later, on January 25th, 1959, announced his plan to convene an ecumenical council. On June the 13th of 1960, about a year and a half later, a French Jewish historian by the name of Jules Isaac visited Pope John the 23rd, carrying with him a dossier filled with the evidence of the Church's role in the teaching of contempt, that millennia-long tradition in the Church, promulgated from parish preachers to university and theology faculty lecture halls to the Holy See itself. That tradition of teaching and language asserting Jews' status as a deicide people. Deicide, a little word that means God killers. Both explicitly and implicitly, those representing Catholic leadership had all too often legitimated persecution and violence. Jules Isaac asked for and received assurance that the Pope would use the opportunity afforded by the Council to get something done here, to raise his voice and to make change. Isaac knew too well the price of the teaching of contempt. 15 years after the end of World War II, 15 years after the end of the Shoah, the Holocaust, he carried the loss of his wife and his daughter, his own survival in hiding in the south of France. Pope John told him that he had every right to expect that something would happen. Indeed, things had begun to happen, because a few days before this visit, on June the 5th, St. Pope John had created the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity. And the following day, June 6th, he appointed Augustine Cardinal Bea as the president and Bishop Johannes Willebrands as secretary. Pope John asked Jules Isaac to discuss his memorandum with Cardinal Bea. And then on September 17th, Pope and Cardinal reflected together on the document, and the Pope decided to put the project under Bea's oversight, with the understanding that this newly founded Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity should facilitate the study of what was called the Jewish question in preparation for the opening of the Council. At this point, there was as yet no question either of a conciliar document on the Church's relationship with the Jewish people, or on the Jewish people in the broader context of the Church's relationship to non-Christian religions. There was simply a mandate to figure this out. At the first plenary meeting of the Secretariat in November, the Secretariat received that mandate from the Pope at Bea's recommendation. There was a sense of urgency and a sense of the personal in this mandate. The Holocaust, the Shoah, was something that all of the engaged parties had lived. Pope John XXIII had actively saved lives during his time as nuncio in Turkey. And two of those people at the Secretariat, and eventually there would be more, but Father John Osterreicher and Father Gregory Baum, Jewish converts, had fled the Nazis. Osterreicher had taken refuge eventually in this country over at Seton Hall University, and Gregory Baum in Canada. Bea himself was German, and the witness of Jules Isaac left with them a vivid message. By early summer of 1962, the Secretariat had prepared material for the scheduled meeting of the Coordinating Commission of the Council, and this material was on ecumenism, religious freedom, and the Jews, three different texts, three different drafts. However, at the last minute, the text on the Jewish people was withdrawn from the agenda. What we know today as Nostra Aetate first came to the council floor on November the 8th, 1963, a year later. It was chapter 4 of the draft of the schema on ecumenism, and it was called Catholic Attitudes Towards Non-Christians, especially the Jews. The text on religious liberty was chapter 5 of the same document. This tiny piece, it's a little scrap of a document. It's slightly over 1,000 words in length, and it was the shortest of all the conciliar documents. It was also perhaps the most bitterly contested inside the council as well as outside. In the words of John O'Malley, the great historian of the council, quote, "Few issues ignited such bitter controversy both inside and outside the council as the relationship of the church to the Jews and then to the other non-Christian religions. The relationship of the Catholic Church to other Christian churches and communities also had a rough ride, but not nearly so rough," he says, "as the relationship to the Jews. That was peculiarly difficult, partly because of the political implications in the Arab world, and partly because of the negative statements about the Jews in the New Testament. And I would add the millennia-long teaching of the deicide charge. The little document went through one revision after another. By the fall of 1963, it had already become clear that the document had to treat of the church's relationship with other non-Christian religions. The Asian bishops pressed for consideration of Hinduism and Buddhism. The African bishops, or the bishops stationed in Africa, asked for consideration of indigenous religions as well, but that was turned down, and for reasons that are not clear to me. In September of 1964, the Secretariat presented a new text with the phrase, "common origin and destiny of humanity," proceeding with positive descriptions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. Then there followed the section on the Jews and conclusions. The text was accepted after all of this bickering and all of the fighting, and sometimes my images is blood on the streets. After all of it, it was accepted with quote unquote many reservations, which meant that it had to go back to the Secretariat for still further revisions. The main sticking point was deicide, the age-old tradition that in killing Jesus, the Jews had killed God. Many people, including St. Pope Paul VI, believed that to state that the Jews were not guilty of deicide would be to deny the divinity of Christ. The document went back to the Secretariat for final revisions, including the removal of the word deicide, and the final vote was taken on Nostra Aetate on October the 28th, 1965, and it passed overwhelmingly. This document caused such a stir because, geopolitical controversy aside, it was indeed revolutionary. It implied on an institutional level that we Catholics learn new ways to understand the world, the self, both collective and personal, and the Church's place in that world. It means a conversion of us, a conversion and a radical turn from proselytism, from a perceived position of authority and superiority to one of encounter and dialogue and mutuality. It was revolutionary. The innovative nature of the document is clear from the fact that apart from scripture references and one reference to Gregory, St. Gregory, there is no reference to precedent in the Church Fathers, conciliar decrees, encyclicals, etc. All of the other documents, it's accepting perhaps religious freedom, and I would need to check that one, but they're full of references to the Church Fathers, to the medieval theologians, to later theologians. There's none of that in Nostra Aetate because it didn't exist. The lack of precedent made it difficult for some council fathers to accept the document, most especially paragraph 4 on the Church's relationship to the Jewish people. To this day, for some, this lack of precedent and the fact that Nostra Aetate is a declaration and not a constitution, these facts call into question the document's authority, or at least the extent of that authority. Other people, perhaps most who know the document and study it, point to its fundamental quality as beginning a turning point and providing a foundation stone for a new body of Catholic teaching. So what was in this little document? Let's take a look. It begins, in our times, Nostra Aetate, when every day people are being drawn closer together and the ties between various peoples are being multiplied, the Church is giving deeper study to her relationship with non-Christian religions. In her task of fostering unity and love among people and even among nations, she gives primary consideration in this document to what human beings have in common and to what promotes fellowship among them, unquote. Thus, the document opens with a look to the larger world beyond the council chambers, beyond the Catholic Church itself. 1965 marked 20 years after the end of the Second World War, the Shoah, the years of destruction tearing the world asunder, killing 1/3 of the Jewish people and leaving millions upon millions, tens of millions of people dead or homeless. It is a world in which colonial empires were dying and new nations emerging. Nostra Aetate notes that people are now drawing closer together and that the Church has a task to foster that. The text notes, people look to the various religions for answers to those profound mysteries of the human condition, which today, even as in olden times, deeply stir the human hearts. What finally is that ultimate and unutterable mystery which engulfs our being and whence we take our rise and whither our journey leads us, unquote. Nostra Aetate uses the word mystery 5 times. It thus places the context of its reflection on non-Christian religion and then on the Church's relationship to the Jewish people in the broader reality that is God's own self, which the document calls the mystery which engulfs our being. The text continues, commenting in general terms on the perennial intuition of, quote, that hidden power which hovers over the course of things and over the events of human life. It then offers brief descriptions of some of the central elements in Hinduism and Buddhism. While limited in scope, the tone is positive. The paragraph ends. The Church, therefore, has this exhortation for her sons and daughters. Prudently and lovingly, through dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions, and in witness of Christian faith and life, acknowledge, preserve, and promote the spiritual and moral goods found among these people, as well as the values in their society and culture, unquote. This call to dialogue and collaboration is new in the history of official church teaching in relation to people of other religions. Paragraph 3 turns to Muslims with a longer comment acknowledging the religious commonalities between Christians and Muslims. Nostra Aetate, paragraph 3, closes with an acknowledgement of historical enmities between Christians and Muslims and ends, on behalf of all humankind, let them, Christians and Muslims, make common cause of safeguarding and fostering social justice, moral values, peace, and freedom. Once again, we see in an official council text the call to dialogue and collaboration implicit in making common cause. There is an implication of walking with the religious other as equals. The text of Nostra Aetate moves to paragraph 4 on the relationship between Christians and Jews, and this is the most developed part of the document. It begins, quote, as the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the Church, it recalls the spiritual bond linking the people of the New Covenant with Abraham's stock. It elaborates some of the ways in which the Church is inextricably related to the Jewish people, whom it calls the people with whom God, in his inexpressible mercy, deigned to establish the ancient covenant. While it mentions opposition to Jesus by some Jews, it goes on to state that, quote, according to the apostle, the Jews still remain most dear to God because of their ancestors, for God does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues, unquote. The Jews, Nostra Aetate says, remain in covenant with God. This statement in this raw kind of direct address to the church is something new in church documents. The document breaks into the historical and theological reflection, quote, since the spiritual patrimony common to Christians and Jews is thus so great, this sacred synod wishes to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect which is the fruit, above all, of biblical and theological studies and of brotherly dialogues. Again, there's a call to explore together the sources of history and religious tradition. Never before had such an official call been issued. Then Nostra Aetate addresses the question for the responsibility of the death of Jesus. The term deicide has been removed from the text after long and bitter debate. However, the document states that, true, authorities of the Jews and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be blamed upon all Jews then living, without distinction, nor upon the Jews of today. Although the church is a new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as repudiated or cursed by God. All should take pains then, lest in catechetical instruction, religious education, and in the preaching of God's word, they teach anything out of harmony with the truth of the gospel and the Spirit of Christ. The document then, quote, repudiates all persecutions against any person. Moreover, mindful of her patrimony with the Jews and motivated by the gospel's spiritual love and by no political considerations, she deplores the hatred, persecutions and displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews at any time and from any source, including Catholics, including Catholic institutions. Paragraph 4 closes with a reminder that the church is to preach, quote, the cross of Christ as a sign of God's all-embracing love and as the fountain from which every grace flows. Paragraph 5, the concluding paragraph, moves to more general concluding reflections on the relationship between the link between a human being's relationship with God as Father and his relationship with his fellow human beings, a link so inextricable that he who does not love does not know God, according to the first letter of John. in the New Testament. The declaration concludes with a statement deploring any, quote, any kind of discrimination against people or harassment of them because of their race, color, condition of life, or religion, and implores, it says, implores all the Christian faithful to maintain good fellowship among the nations, and if possible, as far as in them lies, to keep peace with all people, so that they may truly be sons and daughters of the Father who is in heaven. Nostra Aetate may be the briefest of the council documents, but it has a breathtaking reach, looking outwards to the perennial and universal presence of the divine mystery and the human quest for meaning. It is also breathtaking in its daring, its history-making positive appraisal, and its implied sense of mutuality and call to dialogue and collaboration, implying that all of us need one another in our search for the divine and in our labor of creating a world of justice. With regard to paragraph 4 on the Church's relation to the Jewish people, there are 4 substantive shifts from previous tradition. First, there is the way in which it sees that relationship. Going back to that opening sentence, as the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the Church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock. The relationship with the Jewish people is intrinsic to Christian identity. The work of dialogue and understanding is not extraneous. It is essential to that which makes us Christian. Second, there is the understanding that the Church is in covenant with God because of the Jews, drawing, it says, sustenance from the root of that well-cultivated olive tree onto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles, unquote. It's referring to a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans. Third, for the first time, a church document explicitly decries and deplores anti-Semitism in all its forms. Fourth, as with earlier comments in relation to other religions, there is the call to dialogue and collaboration. So we've talked a bit about how this document got written and what's in it. I'm going to say some things about the reception of Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate was a beginning of new teaching, a new body of teaching, new ways of working, new ways of exploring together what it means to stand before God and each other. Now, I want to just slip in a little parentheses, and I've written about this elsewhere. This document didn't just spring out of nowhere, and it didn't even just spring out of that meeting with between Julie Zach and Pope John the 23rd. The work that led up to this had been going on since at least the beginning of the 20th century, and in some cases back into the 19th century. Bit by bit, people were finding one another and working together. The thing that's new here is the way in which it's articulated in the official Catholic Church documents. In 1964, during the council itself, St. Pope Paul VI established the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, within, that is, the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity. And in 1974, he established the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Already in the 1960s, Roman Catholic monks and nuns had been meeting with monastics from other international traditions. And 1994 saw the formation of Dialogue Interreligieux Monastique, monastic interreligious dialogue. A body of documents has been produced by the Vatican through these various councils and commissions and the collaborators. Most recently, vis-a-vis the Jewish people, there is, in 2015, the document, The Gifts and Calling of God Are Irrevocable, a reflection on theological questions pertaining to Catholic Jewish relations on the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. And then with regard to Muslims and with regard to all people, there is the remarkable quote, a document entitled A Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together, co-signed at Abu Dhabi on February the 4th, 2019, by His Holiness Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmad al-Tayyib. There has been another kind of teaching by religious leaders, beginning with post-conciliar popes. This is through gestures. Massimo Fagioli calls it the magisterium of gestures. Think about the photos of the embrace between Pope Francis, Rabbi Abraham Skorka, and Sheikh Omar Aboud in Jerusalem during their journey to Israel, Palestine, and Jordan in May of 2014. And there are multiple examples. Most recently, this past fall, the photos of the conference in Kazakhstan, attended by religious leaders from a multitude of religious traditions from all over the world, and of course, Pope Francis. Bishops' conferences in some countries have also adopted Nostra Aetate and subsequent documents, and to some measure engaged some of the theological work that has ensued. Nostra Aetate took on a life of its own, and now, nearly 60 years later, there is a whole body of official Catholic teaching, and there is an enormous body of scholarly work that has been done and continues to be done, and there's no sign of that part letting up. In many countries, the new body of teaching has been translated into religious education materials for all ages, community connections, and new ways of relating to one another, both as communities and as individuals. In this country, the study of non-Christian religions and of Judaism flourishes in secular and religious colleges and universities, and in some in some seminaries. The reach of Nostra Aetate has extended far beyond Roman Catholic circles. The work of ecumenical, interfaith, and interreligious understanding and collaboration, as I said, had been going on for decades before Vatican II. That being said, it's also true that the document Nostra Aetate provided new impetus, new energy, not only for Roman Catholics, but for others. It led to the foundation in 1967 of IJCIC, the International Jewish Committee for the Interreligious Consultations, to represent Jews to the Vatican, and later with other religious, non-Jewish religions and non-Catholic Christian denominations. It gave new impulse to the Parliament of World Religions, that enormous gathering of people from all over the world, from every tradition, from traditional religions to mainline Christian religions, to Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. The next meeting will take place this summer in Chicago. In 1970, the International Catholic Jewish Liaison Committee was established by the Vatican. And other Christian denominations have extended their own work, producing their own materials. However, there's much more to interreligious work than clerical leaders making official pronouncements or scholars engaging in academic research, as important as those things are. In 1984, St. Pope John Paul II addressed the Pontifical Commission for Interreligious Dialogue on the scope of dialogue in an address called Dialogue and Mission. In 1994, the same principles were reiterated even more clearly in the document Dialogue and Proclamation. And that document speaks of 4 modes of dialogue. And these are jumping off points in some ways, not simply a confining thing. And I'm going to quote this. A, the dialogue of life, where people strive to live in an open and neighborly spirit, sharing their joys and sorrows, their human problems and preoccupations. B, the dialogue of action, in which Christians and others collaborate for the integral development and liberation of people. C, the dialogue of theological exchange, where specialists seek to deepen their understanding of their respective religious heritages and to appreciate each other's spiritual values. D, the dialogue of religious experience, where persons rooted in their own religious traditions, sharing their spiritual riches, for instance, with regard to prayer and contemplation, faith and ways of searching for God or the absolute. end of quote. So let's take a look at each of these, although not necessarily in the same order. Lots of times when people talk about interreligious dialogue, they think of scholars or clerics, the official types. So I'm going to take a look at that one. The document calls it the dialogue of theological exchange. I would broaden this to call it the dialogue of scholarly exchange, for it includes everything from sociology to history, from the biblical period to the present. This is the arena in which I've spent a lot of my life, as Maria says. It takes place certainly in the obvious venues of ecclesiastical and Jewish institutional environs, in seminaries and rabbinical schools, at the Vatican, in national conferences of bishops. It's engaged in settings such as also as the annual conference of the Council of Centers for Jewish-Christian Relations, or the annual session of the International Conference of Christians and Jews, or the Abrahamic Forum. But it also takes place in academic secular conferences such as the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature. It takes place as scholars move back and forth between their offices or consult by phone or WhatsApp or Zoom, conferring about their work, checking in with one another, often exchanging news about family and friends. In some contexts, this kind of exchange has transformed some areas of religious studies, such as the study of the New Testament, early Christianity, and early Judaism. So much so that there are now Jews who are recognized experts in the study of the New Testament and early Christianity, and there are Christians equally specialized in the study of early Judaism. What difference does this make? It sounds a bit esoteric, doesn't it? Christianity, like Judaism, is grounded in its foundational, that is, its canonical texts. Christianity is, but how those texts are interpreted makes a difference, especially in relation to understanding the materials around the death of Jesus, conflicts with the people called the Pharisees, and views of the others. We think of the ways in which the deicide charge, the charge that the Jews killed God, was used to legitimate the persecution of Jews, and we know that this transformation of scholarship can indeed make a difference. Jesus is understood now by some, and maybe many even, but both scholars and some people in the pews, to be part of his very complex and complicated world, not as outside his tradition or superseding it. But most people are not scholars in the area of Jewish-Christian relations or interfaith or interreligious dialogue. The other three categories belong to everybody. And this is an essential point. In the context of this developing tradition, Pope John Paul II told us in 1984, every Christian is called to interfaith, interreligious, and ecumenical dialogue. In the words of Dialogue and Mission, he says, no local church is exempt from this duty, which is made urgent by continuous changes. Because of migrations, travels, social communications, and personal choices, believers of different religions and easily meet each other and often live together. The challenge and the call to interfaith dialogue is lent a sense of urgency by our world's rapidly changing demographic realities. For believers of different religions may easily meet with one another in contexts new or old, but those encounters may be fraught with traditional stereotypes or perhaps memories of bad experiences from former lands. My favorite phrase in this context is dialogue of life, where it says, people strive to live in an open and neighborly spirit, sharing their joys and sorrows, their human problems and preoccupations. I think about my neighborhood with its large Muslim population. Many people are frightened, both because they might be undocumented, and this goes for the Catholic population in the neighborhood as well. But the Muslims are also frightened, sometimes because of the anti-Islamic prejudice and even hatred that is so prevalent in our society. Like many new immigrants, they are working too hard, too many hours in a week to engage in anything extra. But there is the dialogue of life a spirit of neighborliness, and I enjoy the greetings on the street, the conversations with shopkeepers, often sharing our religious traditions in a variety of ways. There's also the dialogue of action, in which Christians and others collaborate for the integral development and liberation of people. Collaboration on so many levels, working together for the social and physical well-being of all our people. Think of those iconic photos of Dr. Martin Luther King, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and Father Daniel Berrigan marching in Selma. Selma, where so many people, including some of the sisters in my own congregation, and perhaps yours too, Maria, traveled hundreds of miles by bus to join local African Americans and whites in the struggle. They faced the possibility of arrests, beatings, jail, and worse. More modestly, in the realm most of us inhabit, there is a collaboration on all kinds of social issues and projects, from immigration and soup kitchens to care of creation, to voting rights, voter registration, and more. We do all of this because we are Christians, Jews, and Muslims, whose traditions teach us to care for the poor, the stranger, and the vulnerable, and the oppressed. Finally, there's the dialogue of religious experience, quote, where persons rooted in their own religious traditions share their spiritual riches, for instance, with regard to prayer and contemplation, faith in the ways of searching for God, or the absolute. We think of monastics from Eastern and Western religious traditions, sitting and teaching one another about contemplation. And there are gatherings like in our coalition, a congregational modeled Seder, an annual Thanksgiving service, an interfaith choral concert. Jews joined our parish congregation for the celebration of Our Lady of Guadalupe. This is hard work. In this journey toward one another and toward the divine, that mystery that engulfs us all, we work together, joining in a relationship of what Pope Francis calls a dialogue of fraternity, or St. Pope John Paul II called solidarity, in which we not only meet one another in new respect and friendship, but join together in collaboration in the face of the social problems that threaten all of us, both human beings and the planet itself. This is hard work because it means letting go of old preconceptions and assumptions about ourselves and about others, letting the other person be as he or she is. It is, in other words, as Philip Cunningham says, a process of mutuality that means a deepening of love for the distinctiveness of the other because of their edifying ways of walking with God. The opening words of section 4 of Nostra Aetate introduce the document's consideration of the Church's relationship to the Jewish people. Quote, as the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the Church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock, unquote. These words place Christian-Jewish relations at the heart of the Church's understanding of its own identity. Nostra Aetate speaks of that identity as a mystery, suggesting a never-ending quest for what is ultimately only revealed by God. As Robert Gordis and Peter Fahn remind us, we seek to understand more about ourselves and our world than we can possibly comprehend. Our reach exceeds our grasp. The journey into mystery suggests that Catholic-Jewish relations, as is true of all forms of ecumenical, interfaith, and interreligious dialogue, is a matter of spiritual experience. The word mystery invites us into the contemplative depth of God, of the divine, of the absolute, of our traditions, and of the vast space opened up by the process of encounter and conversation. Why bother? After all, the going is sometimes uncomfortable. Isn't interfaith a luxury, a frivolous activity for those who have the, quote, time to engage? Interfaith work is important because, as Nostra Aetate teaches us, it is part of Catholic identity. We discover our Jewish neighbors as we probe the mystery of our very identity. And this work is urgent because 85% or more of the world's peoples are affiliated in one way or the other to a religious tradition. Brutal wars, such as that between Serbia and Bosnia and others, too many others, have been fought along religious lives in recent decades. No religious community, with the exception maybe of the Baha'i, can claim clean hands in the violence of these years. Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Christians, Muslims, animists, we have all killed one another, literally in the name of God. The list is endless. Religion is indeed a path to violence and bloodshed, as is the common parlance, legitimating all manner of injustice against the innocent, or it can be. But religion can also provide the way of and to peace, to social justice. One thinks of groups in Israel such as the Interfaith Encounter Association, or the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel, or the Elijah Interfaith Institute. One thinks of international groups such as Religions for Peace. And the UN in 2011 inaugurated its first annual World Interfaith Harmony Week. Today, even as we reflect together on Nostra Aetate, the Diocese of El Paso, Texas, has been working with El Paso Interreligious Sponsoring Organization bordering interfaith to train more than 500 people in leading synodal listening sessions. That collaboration extends to helping people organize to meet some of the vast array of needs challenging the communities of the border. Now, what are some of the challenges that lie ahead? I'm going to be concentrating my comments here mainly on this country, although some of my remarks will extend elsewhere. Nearly 60 years ago, Nostra Aetate offered daring new perspectives on the Church's relationship to non-Christian religions and to the Jewish people. I've given a broad and general view of its reception. Too general, too broad, and too sketchy, but a little bit. At the same time, interfaith and interreligious work faces serious challenges in this country. While many of my remarks have a global reference, I will focus on challenges here. Although, as I said, some of these will also are reflected in other contexts. For the American Catholic engagement in ecumenical, interfaith, and interreligious relations, I think one of the primary challenges is the polarization of our society and of our church. How do we engage with people who differ from us politically? How do we reach across socioeconomic, class, ethnic, and racial divides in respect and, yes, hospitality? All the more difficult. How do we reach across the divides in our own church with respect for those who have different understandings of Catholic identity? Our inabilities in these fundamental questions threaten the continuation of interfaith and interreligious engagement. And that same polarization makes this work all the more important. In this context, we face a lack of leadership by many of our bishops, not all, but by many of our bishops and pastoral leaders, whether clergy or lay, despite the hope offered by engagement in the synodal way. The vibrant institutional commitment and involvement of the first 3 decades after the Council has steadily diminished in this country. So while it is true that there is still a great deal of outreach in many spheres of life and work, the leadership no longer comes from the U.S. Catholic Conference or even most of our dioceses. To be sure, the USCCB Committee on Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs has held over the past 60 years and continues to do so regular meetings with representatives of the National Council of Synagogues, the Orthodox Union, and now the Modern Orthodox Group. The committee issued on November 18th, this past November 18th, a document called A Recommitment to Relationship with the Jewish Community, with particular reference to the escalation of anti-Semitism in this country. The leadership of more sustained work, however, has moved to the many centers and institutes on college and university campuses, as well as in some seminaries, many of those Catholic. The work being done there is excellent. However, most seminary and pastoral education programs do not integrate the Church's teaching on ecumenism, Jewish, Christian, and interreligious relations into the training of those who will lead grassroots communities. If courses are offered, they are often electives and not required. Ecumenism, interfaith, and interreligious relations remain in the minds of too many something extra, something for the specialists. In all fairness, bishops and pastoral workers, whether clergy or lay, are simply inundated with the demands of work in the extraordinarily complex context of 21st century US Catholic life. Inundated is probably too small a word, overwhelmed. Ecumenical, interfaith, and interreligious work can seem extraneous to the demands of holding together communities beset by challenges ranging from poverty and immigration and racism to the structuring of parish life and maintaining the energy of the community. And many of our communities are simply exhausted given the impact of the pandemic. All the more reason why we need pastoral leaders whose formation integrates interreligious relations in the same way it integrates or should integrate social justice and the care of creation. We need leaders who can translate the work being done in official circles or academic arenas to the lives of our grassroots communities. For instance, the research on the Pharisees should be reflected in Sunday homilies. Another challenge is a dramatic escalation of anti-Semitism evident online and in person, in political speech, vandalism, in-person attacks, the bullying of children, and physical violence. It is subtly and not so subtly linked to the intensification of racism. Many of the challenges that face Jews at this point in our history also face Muslims, Hindus, and others. These forms of bigotry are entwined with racism and tropes of geopolitics. The hard work, the welcoming of the other with everything that makes her or him different, brings us up against the limitations not only of our own individual minds and hearts and experience, but often the limitations of our communities. And this can be hard and humbling. And so we walk a desert path. We welcome one another, and we cook food for a communal feast. We pray in vigil in solidarity with our brothers and sisters threatened with deportation. We work together in ways great and small in the care of our fragile Mother Earth. We study, we learn new traditions, the traditions of people who once may have seemed strange, other. And in doing so, we learn our own traditions in new ways through the conversation. Why bother? Because God is bigger than us all. Infinitely more than any tradition can contain, confine, bear. And the needs of our world, our earth, exceed the capacities of any one group to provide the care. We need to cherish our traditions, our identities, and we need the boundaries to help us know who we are. And we need to reach across the boundaries to know who we are and to build a better world, a place of safety and justice for all. Indeed, to save the world that all of us believe in one way or another has been given into our keeping. Thank you. So I'd be happy to, my sister, I'd be happy to take any questions. I don't know if I can answer, but I'll be happy to take them.
Celia, who was this man that came and talked to John 23rd? I never heard his name before.
Jules Isaac. Jules Isaac was a French historian. And one of the interesting things about this document, and the kind of, you think about the images and the photos around it, is three old men, three octogenarians, Jules Isaac, Saint Pope John the 23rd, and Augustin Cardinal Bea. They were all in their 80s, and two of them, Isaac and John the 23rd, died before Nostra Aetate was approved. Jules Isaac was a French, he was quite well respected as an historian in the south of France, from Aix-en-Provence. And he'd been a secondary school teacher, and then he moved into supervisory positions, and he was very well regarded. And his wife and his daughter died in the camps, and he himself had to go into hiding. He and his son survived by going into hiding, and he was hidden by a Christian woman. And he compiled, shall we say, evidence from the sources, from Christian sources, among other things, going all the way back to the first centuries, of what he called l'enseignement du mépris, the teaching of contempt. And so after the Second World War, when he was able to come out of hiding, he was in connection with other Jews and with Christians, and sometimes they had been in connection with one another before the war, and some of these people had been hiding Jews during the war, and some of them were sisters of Our Lady of Sion. I'm very proud of the role we played in those times, as you know. So at any rate, some of them convened at the end of the war in 1948 at Salisbury in Switzerland, and they drew up a document talking about things that needed for the Christian churches, because these were Protestants as well as Catholics, that needed to happen. And so he added this to his pile of things, and of course he was part of this work. And then in 1960, he was able to get an appointment with John the 23rd, and he brought the whole dossier with him, including recommendations for what should happen. And so that's who Jules Isaac was. But John the 23rd had already been thinking. John the 20th, the counselor, the preparatory commission, had sent out questionnaires to the theological faculties, to the bishops, to the higher ups for consultation before, and asking what people might want to see. And nobody said anything about the Jews, except some of the scholars at the Biblicum. They wanted to see something being done about the ways in which the church understands its relationship to the Jewish people. So his work, that work, John the 23rd's own very, very personal experience, all of it kind of converged. And then the personal experience of a lot of the other people. But Jules Isaac's visit was one of the key things. Yes, Hugh.
Who were some of the early proponents of changing the church's attitude towards Jews, pushing against the anti-Semitism in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
Okay. Let's see. Okay. There were whole lists of these people, okay? And going back to the early years of the 20th century, the 1920s, say, there was, let's see, a man named François. The Maritains were very involved in this. Jules Monchanin from Lyon, this is moving into the 30s. Jules Monchanin ended up in India by the end of the 30s, living out the rest of his life in an ashram. And he was one of the sort of the pivotal people in the connection with Hinduism. Louis Massignon, the great Islamic scholar, was involved in this. Paul Desman, a father of Sion, was one of the leaders in terms of the thinking. Yves Congar Henri de Lubac. And then in Central Europe, there was another whole collection of people. And Osterreicher was part of that before he had to leave. And then he stayed in touch. Some of the people, like Deman and Osterreicher, were multilingual, so they were in both camps, the French language camp and the German language camp, you know, and they were all sort of fertilizing their thinking. Is this helping? Okay. One of the interesting things to me, and one of the crucial things to me, is that this work was being done, and then there was also work going on in this country and in England, all over the place. But the personal relationships, like these people became friends. In France, one of the interesting things was people would meet in salons in various cities. Paris, there were some, and Lyon, there was another kind of center of meeting. And then they would just change, you know, like they would just go to one another's, and everybody was mixing and mingling, and they would very often, they developed a model, and actually it was Jules Monchanin that sort of suggested that they read a psalm in Hebrew and French, and there would be a discourse. We'd take turns giving discourses about a topic of common interest, and then they would socialize. And so these were very close friendships. Now, sometimes they wanted to convert one another, and it's not like, you know, there was this kind of late 20th century theology that emerged immediately, but there was a kind of progressing forward. And one of the key things in this was the ongoing reflection on Romans 9 to 11. That started in the early 1900s, and it continued, and it shows up in in Nostra Aetate. So, Nostra Aetate was a breakthrough, but it's a breakthrough because it's the official statement. It wasn't the beginning. When people say, oh, it began, no, it didn't begin. It began decades and decades before. And then with regard to Hinduism and Buddhism, some of that had to do with exposure through the colonial empires and people meeting people, and sometimes being very sort of condescending, but learning that Hindus were people, and beginning to learn the wealth and the richness of those traditions. Oh.
We have a couple of questions from the virtual audience, and some comments. So I'd like to begin with the first one. I guess this person's wondering about how reciprocal what you're talking about is. The question is, well, what do you say about the poor treatment of Christians in Israel and the Islamic world? And what of the hateful passages regarding Jesus in the Talmud? I just said, here are a couple of questions from the audience.
Okay.
Let me stand with you. So this question was, well, how do you deal with the treatment of Christians in Israel and the Islamic world? And what about the hateful passages regarding Jesus in the Talmud? How do I deal with this? Yes.
Do I think it's okay? No, I don't think it's okay that anybody ever be mistreated. And I think it varies from country to country, and it also it varies from period to period. Christians' rights in Israel are protected, and I can say that because we are there. And given the recent developments, things are getting more and more difficult, but our rights are protected. In the Arab world, it depends on which country. So in some countries, Christians live, there are fewer and fewer Christians in the Arab world. For example, much of the Christian community of Iraq is gone, and the entire Jewish community of Iraq is gone now. And that had been the oldest continuing community in the world, but it's gone. So I'm not sure even how to answer that. I do not think persecution of anybody is okay. And very often, religion is sort of the covering category for economic issues and political and social issues. So I think, yeah.
So I have another question here from Rita Houlihan. She says, first, I'm distressed that Nick Fuentes, who declares he's a Catholic, is publicly anti-Semitic. He has a high profile with young American conservatives. I looked to our bishops to condemn him, but have not seen specific statements warning Catholics that anti-Semitism is a serious sin. How do you recommend that I and others approach our cardinals and bishops? We need serious leadership to combat the escalation of anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hate.
I would suggest that the person, I don't know where this person has come from, which diocese.
I don't know, maybe Boston.
Okay, whichever diocese that she go to the person in the diocese who is charged with the responsibility for relationships with for interfaith and interreligious affairs and ecumenism, and talk to that person, and then see that's the initial step, and lay out the issue, what she sees as the issues, and even takes a draft of something. One of the things I think that happens in this kind of inertia is that, as I said, people, for one thing, it becomes a kind of an extra, but people are indeed overwhelmed. And sometimes there's a willingness to act if people bring it forward as a concern with some suggestions about how to operate. So that's what I would do.
Thank you. And another question from our audience. Why do you think the American bishops and American seminaries have lost interest in ecumenism?
I honestly don't know. I've got some guesses. I think one of the things that's happened, I don't know. I think, frankly, the collective, not individual bishops, but I think the collective has gotten really preoccupied by the culture wars. I think they have done splendid work and are doing splendid work with immigration. And there's some good work in some places going on around care for creation. Some places in interreligious, and so it's not, you can't say nothing happens. But I do think the polarization of the country and the preoccupation with the culture wars has also impacted our church and our church leaders. So, and then with regard to seminary curriculum, I know that the curriculum is enormously heavy, and sometimes it's too heavy, and so of course the quote unquote extras go, but even more than having a required course in world religions or in Judaism or in Islam is the need to integrate these concerns into the curriculum so that people undergoing pastoral formation, whether it's as clergy or whether it's as lay leaders, understand that this is part of who we are, not simply that you add it on. And I think there's a lack of imagination in that, and maybe a lack of fire in the belly.
I have a question myself, and it's a little awkward, having just recently buried Pope Emeritus Benedict, but sometimes people have understood some of the things that Benedict did as a case of the church taking, 8 steps forward with Nostra Aetate and then 10 steps backwards with some of the things that Benedict said. Some of his assertions, I think it was in his Regensburg address, what he had to say about Muslims. And then in Dominus Jesus, I think the document that he produced in the late 90s where he reasserts the,
2000.
The Christology. Basically, it's through Christ or no way. And so that whole idea of the irrevocability of the covenant with the Jewish people seems to have been overshadowed. So what will you say? I mean, since Vatican II, have you seen, or do you believe the Church has taken any steps backwards, or at least in popular understanding? Would that be the case, Celia?
Okay, if you're talking about in terms of the Vatican, when you're talking about the Church, I mean the Vatican.
Yeah.
I think there are. My description of all of it is we lurch. When I think of it, even before this Nostra Aetate, and Nostra Aetate is not a perfect document. I mean, sometimes I read some of the language and it's kind of cringeworthy, frankly, but it's foundational and it's revolutionary. And so we take all people and all communities and all families, we lurch through life and we take 2 steps forward and at least 1, if not 2 or 3 steps backwards. So sometimes popes have done really awkward things, including John the 23rd, who was beloved in the Jewish community, not John the 23rd, but John Paul II. And he caused some real furors by some of the things he did. Benedict also said things in some really unfortunate ways, and at one point reinstated the old Good Friday prayer into the Tridentine Mass that he was allowing to be said. One of the things that I think is fair to say is that Benedict almost never consulted the people in the Pontifical Commission for Relations with Jewish People. And the same thing with John Paul II. They didn't consult their own experts before doing something. A lot of trouble could have been saved. But again, we lurch forward and then we pull back and then it gets sorted out. So I am not willing to think about Benedict. I think he was an enormously complicated human being. And yeah, he didn't have the kind of popular touch with the Jewish community that John Paul II did. He didn't have the personal experience either. He didn't grow up with Jews like John Paul II did. John Paul II grew up in a town that was 30% Jewish. So, I mean, when he said, my best friends are Jews, I mean, he meant it. Even when he was doing things that really angered people. And now Francis grew up with Jews in Buenos Aires and has close personal friends. So there's a difference there. And there's just a difference in personality. Yeah. By the way, one of the things I think that is different, though, Maria, is when these things happen, and this is one thing that I find is kind of critical with what's gone on with the USCCB. There have been channels through which to address them, through which to address the hurt and the grievance and to sort things out. The USCCB is less strong now and there. Yeah. Okay.
My question is this. What if you just use the simple statement, Jesus was a Jew, Mary was a Jew, Joseph was a Jew, Peter, James, John, Andrew, Paul, all were Jews. Those statements don't require qualification. They say exactly what is true. And so that's one of the things that I don't hear when we talk about the responsibility of the Jewish community for the death of Christ, for example, that all of the earliest Christians were Jews. I just think that that's got to be part of it. And I want to hear people say Jesus was a Jew. I want to hear that.
That's right. And by the way, Nostra Aetate is quite clear on that. And this body of documents is very, very clear on it. And furthermore, this increasing, the stack of paper that gets higher and higher, whether it's online or not, it keeps reiterating the need for Christians to study Jewish sources of that period and to understand Jesus and our earliest sources in the light of Second Temple Judaism. Yes, because these people are Jews.
It's 8:45, and we could go on with a lot of questions. And certainly, Pat is a scripture teacher myself. One of the hardest things in a Catholic Bible class is to convince students that Jesus was a Jew. So much of filmmaking with Max von Sydow and blondes and blue-eyed people have really wrecked the image. So maybe we need to bring in art to accompany what we're doing, change the tradition. But tonight, I'm very grateful to Celia Deutsch. She did a wonderful job of helping us understand Nostra, Aetate, and maybe to, in our own lives, think about when's the last time we had a conversation with somebody who was not like ourselves, and to make it a practice, maybe in this new year, 2023, to reach out from our places of comfort to the other, so that we can really become one people and do as the council document said, look for what is common among us as human beings, and as John the 23rd said, look for what unites us, not for what divides us. Thank you for coming. Thanks everyone in the virtual office. Good night. See you on the 25th when Father Gerald O'Collins from Australia will be joining us to talk on the spirituality of the Second Vatican Council. Good night now. Thanks. Thank you so much.